the stories. This motel room voicemail raised a separate question. On a rainy Tuesday near the end of tourist season, a motel room voicemail carried a question that did not belong. It turned a tired end of shift into something careful and strange, and it started with a blinking red light. Dorian Pike worked nights at the Northway Motor Inn, 37, a patient manager who fixed things others ignored. The place sat off a service road past a truck stop, with a diner and a feed store as neighbors. He started that shift with a simple goal: balance the register, finish the towel count, and coax the ice machine back alive. The storm slowed arrivals, and the security monitor rolled its quiet grayscale loop of the parking lot. Housekeeping left a note about room 12, the kind of note other managers forgot to read. The bed looked unused after checkout, the television glowed at low volume, and the phone message light blinked at eye level. He carried a spare key, pushed the door open, and smelled damp carpet and motel soap. Nothing surprising. The news channel murmured through commercials, a static map of counties he could name without trying. On the nightstand sat a spiral notebook half full of block letters, a takeout cup, and a key card with the room number worn. He pressed the voicemail button with his knuckle because the button shocked him once in summer. A male voice filled the room with a flat question that stopped his hand, like a bad chord laid wrong. The voice asked, "Did you move the smoke detector again?" And then silence, followed by the system tone and cutoff. He replayed it twice, and the question felt like a pebble in a shoe, something to be dealt with. Smoke detectors did not get moved by guests without reason, and nothing about the room said routine or careless. Dorian checked the detector on the ceiling, a cheap white unit that did not match the others on the hall. The motel used one supplier for replacements, and this casing lacked their sticker and the penciled date inside. He stood on the chair, unscrewed the ring, and found fresh scuffs around the mounting plate as if removed recently. The unit felt heavier than a sensor should, and the test light never flashed, which meant battery or guts. He set it down on the table, and the vent above the television rattled just a little with the wind. He turned off the television, let the room get quiet, and heard faint tapping through the vent to the next room. The motel had a habit of telling its secrets through noise, and he had learned that language over years. He stepped into the hall and knocked on room 14, where a regular was finishing a long week of field work. Quinn Hauer was 29, a cell tower contractor with a tool bag and a precise way of speaking. Quinn opened the door and said, "Heard the tapping, thought it was heat, but it kept hitching, like somebody counting seconds." Dorian nodded, thanked him, and walked back to room 12 with the detector in his hands and a growing list. He checked the guest ledger for that room, found the name Shane Bennett written in rough ballpoint yesterday afternoon. The rate was paid in cash with a $20 deposit, and there was a note about requesting a high floor. The motel only had 2 floors, which made the request sound like reflex, not preference, and it bothered him. He logged into the creaking PBX console behind the office door, a beige box that stored more than it admitted. The system kept message times, not caller numbers, but it stored archived call counts and extension traces within limits. The voice message timestamp put the call at 4:21 this morning when he had been home asleep. The system marked it as external to the motel, but without a number, which meant blocked or masked through a service. He played the message once more through the PBX speaker, and this time he listened past the words to the air. There was a faint horn in the background, not a car, something long and low that cut through the compressor hum. The town had 2 train crossings, one near the elevator factory, the other near the river access by Mill Road. The factory horn sounded higher by habit, and the river crossing had a long, lonely tone that travelers remembered. He wrote train horn in the notebook, then dialed the non-emergency line and described a suspicious device in room 12. He kept the language careful and factual, and the dispatcher asked for his name, then said a unit would respond. Housekeeper Irina Kowalski stopped by the desk to clock out. 58. Quiet. A 10-year veteran of the place. She saw the detector on the counter and said she smelled glue when she changed linens, thought it came from that. He asked if she saw anyone in room 12 after checkout, and she said only a woman with a baseball cap. She had a service bucket and a ring of keys, and Irina thought she was with maintenance since she walked like staff. There were 2 maintenance guys by payroll. Neither wore caps, and neither worked Tuesdays after 3 in the afternoon. He wrote this down, then checked a clipboard of deliveries and found a package signed by someone not on schedule. The box came yesterday morning for guest Bennett, signed by a scrawl that did not match any front desk initials. It contained a replacement smoke detector per the note, which made the blinking voicemail question feel heavier. Dorian carried the box to the office, found bubble wrap inside, plus a cutout where the detector had Saturday, tape residue stuck in a neat circle on the cardboard, and a tiny zip bag with nothing in it fell from a seam. He looked at the detector again under the desk lamp and noticed a slot behind the grill where no slot should be. He slid a paperclip in and clicked against something spring-loaded, which offered and then refused to move. The responding officer arrived while the storm thickened, and his boots left dark prints that dried like islands. He introduced himself as Deputy Holloway, 40, calm voice, and asked for the room key, the voicemail, and the timeline. Dorian played the message for him on the office speaker, and the train horn showed itself again under the words. Holloway wrote it down, then called in the serial from the detector, and the brand came back to a discount dropshipper. They walked to room 12 with the box, and Holloway took photos with a little camera that hated the low light. He gave Dorian latex gloves from his pocket, then pointed at the slot and said he would rather not break it. Dorian tried the paperclip again, this time with a little twist and a push, and the plate popped forward an inch. Inside sat something that was not a sensor, a puck with a lens barely visible, and a microcard at the edge. He did not pull it, he did not touch the lens, he just looked at Holloway, whose jaw tightened for 3 beats. The deputy called dispatch and asked for a detective on call, then told Dorian to step back and breathe. The motel office had a rule about honesty with guests, which worked until honesty touched evidence and risk. Dorian printed a sign for the counter that said service delay for weather, and the storm covered that small necessary lie. Holloway kept the room closed and waited for the detective, while Dorian returned to the PBX to audit messages. He printed the log for the last 2 days, circled 3 external calls to room 12, all between midnight and 5. He played the first 2 messages carefully, and they were empty hang-ups, with the same horn underneath and 1 faint laugh. He resisted all guessing and wrote horn consistent in a margin, then underlined the time of the 3rd message. He checked the security drive for the hallway, and the camera caught only the tops of heads and a bit of shoulder. At 3:12 this morning, a person in a cap walked by with a tote, turned left, and vanished from frame. Dorian paused on the frame and noted the sleeve stripes, a set of 2 pale bands near the wrist. Irena had seen a cap on the woman, and the frame showed hair tucked tight, with a loose strand at the neck. Detective Renner arrived with a kit and a steady patience, a mid-40s investigator who disliked motel carpet. She listened to the voicemail twice, glanced at the detector, and asked Dorian to walk her through intake and checkout. He explained the cash payment, the request for a high floor, and the delivery for a detector that should not change. She wrote as he talked, asked about prior incidents, and he mentioned 2 privacy complaints from summer travelers. Those complaints stopped after he replaced room units from the same run, and he had kept the receipts and dates. He pulled copies from the accordion file, and she photographed them, then asked whether any rooms shared vent passageways. He described the vent layout, straight shaft between rooms in pairs, with thin walls that carried sound farther than comfort. Renner nodded and walked to room 14, asked Quinn to step into the hall, and confirmed the tapping report. Quinn described the pace like a metronome, not random, 2 taps, then a short pause, repeated until the thunder started. Renner wrote it down, and Dorian drew the pattern in a margin, then realized something he had missed earlier today. The television in room 12 was on the news channel at low volume, which travelers often used as a decoy. Some people left it on to pretend someone was inside, which meant the room might have been staged after a quick exit. Renner opened the detector with gloves and eased the card into a tiny envelope, then sealed it with her initials. She asked Dorian about any computers to view file sizes, not contents, just metadata, and he shook his head no. She used her agency laptop to check what the card held, and the screen reflected in the blank television glass. The card contained multiple files named by date and time, a standard naming scheme, which meant scheduled recording, not motion. Renner closed the laptop without opening anything and said the specifics would wait for a warrant and a lab. She asked for the guest profile again, and he gave the same summary, plus the note about the signed delivery receipt. Dorian returned to the box and saw a faint watermark in the cardboard that read Consolidated Freight with a Town. The town sat by the river tracks where the Longhorn lived, and the company ran a warehouse near the ramp. He wrote the company down as an external lead, then called the number printed on their listing from a web search. He asked, in his perfectly polite desk voice, whether any packages left for a motel guest yesterday morning. The dispatcher said they handed one small box to a contractor with a name that matched no employee on file. It was recorded on their log with a time, and the signature block contained the same scrawl as his earlier photocopy. Renner thanked him for the call, took the information, and said she would handle any next contact with that company. She requested the spiral notebook from the room, and Dorian placed it in a bag, pages open to the block letters. The letters contained hotel names and highway exits, a list of routes that matched a traveler who did not like surprises. Some lines included cable channel numbers, others included lamplight wattages, and one included the word ceiling with a star. Dorian remembered a complaint from 2 weeks ago from a different guest about a beeping detector in room 5. He checked his maintenance log and found he replaced that unit on a Wednesday after a short argument about deposit charges. He fetched the old detector from the storage shelf, where broken things went to wait for disposal, and compared its weight. The broken one felt light as expected, and the one from room 12 felt like two of them taped together. He unscrewed the broken one and found no strange slot, only dust, a dead battery, and the usual brittle plastic. Renner watched from the doorway and nodded, then answered her phone, and her yes sounded like cautious confirmation. The non-emergency dispatcher had pulled 2 archived calls from the spring that sounded similar, not identical, but close. Each referenced a detector, each asked whether it had been moved, and both targeted rooms paid in cash and late. Renner asked Dorian to print any copies of photo identification kept on file, and he showed the log policy instead. The inn did not photocopy identification unless the card used for payment had a name mismatch or a mismatch with booking. He looked at the lobby camera track for the check-in, and the frame showed a jacket with sleeve stripes again. The face never lifted to the lens, and the cap brim hid most features, but the build matched the hallway pass. The storm eased into a steady pour, the kind that makes a street look polished, and the motel sign clicked. Renner gave Dorian a statement form and asked him to write what he did and why, as precisely as possible. He wrote that a voicemail raised a secret question about a smoke detector, which is not a thing guests ask. He wrote that the detector was wrong for the room, that its weight felt off, and that a slot existed. He wrote that a horn in the background suggested a location near the river tracks and that a freight watermark helped. He wrote that a woman with a cap carried a tote down the hall, and that tapping came through the vent. Renner finished securing the room and returned the hallway to regular use, with a note to keep room 12 closed. She told Dorian that similar devices had surfaced in short-term rentals nearby, and that his details tightened the pattern. She thanked Irena and Quinn for their help, then left with Holloway and the sealed card and the odd detector. Dorian stood in the quiet office and watched the parking lot glow under a light that had survived 4 storms this month. He made copies of everything for the file, then sat with the register and finished what he started hours earlier. The ice machine hummed to life with a stubborn cough, which felt like a small mercy after the nervous work. 2 days later, Renner called to say the voicemail mattered more than he realized because of the horn and the freight. The freight record placed a contractor truck at the warehouse near the river during the call window before dawn. She said the case would likely spread across jurisdictions and that his notes already sat in a shared folder. She did not share more, and he did not ask, because he understood the slow way these things must move to hold. Quinn checked out with a handshake and a tight thanks, and Irena started a new hallway routine that included ceiling checks. The motel added a policy line about devices, not because it fixed the world, but because it set a tone. On the next Tuesday, the phone light blinked again in a different room, and Dorian felt a breath catch. He pressed the button and heard a normal message from a family asking for extra towels, and he laughed because relief deserves sound. He still thought about the spiral notebook, about the starred word ceiling, and about the staged television glow. He thought about the simple question that did not belong, and how such questions sometimes open doors no one planned. Travelers came and went, the storm season thinned, and the parking lot felt like a stage that forgot its lines. Dorian kept the office tidy and the camera lenses clean, and he learned to trust the hairs rising on his arm. The Lost Logbook of Barrow Station. Residents of Utqiagvik in the North Slope Borough reportedly whispered about a missing logbook that surfaced one winter, a notebook tied to routine ice monitoring notes that hinted something unaccounted happened near sea ice ridges close to Point Barrow during 2019. The notebook belonged to Raymond Cole, age 59, a contracted field technician assigned to Barrow Station by a state research subcontractor living in town to document ice thickness changes and daily wildlife observations along the Chukchi Edge. Dispatch logs from the University Coordination Office showed routine check-ins until January 10th, then gaps appeared without supervisor explanation. Neighbors later said Cole kept predictable routines walking past Stevenson Street toward the shoreline each dusk, carrying measurement rods and a handheld radio for short-range alerts. Investigators noted Cole traveled alone most days, despite protocols requesting pairs in winter-field months due to wind chill hazards and unpredictable snow squalls. County file from 2009 referenced similar incidents of isolated technicians losing orientation after coastal gusts disrupted visibility, though no documented fatality occurred in that earlier case, and search teams responded quickly. State records confirmed Cole completed cold weather training in Anchorage, yet archived notes suggested he informally pushed hours to chase daylight windows several locals claimed were unsafe. The logbook pages described ice plates forming shallow ridges, movements subtle but present as temperatures dropped near -30. Cole wrote sentence after sentence, noting pressure cracks widening before midnight flare checks, and his wording grew more clinical, according to handwriting analysts. He marked polar bear prints near the western bluff on January 8th, then wrote that radio static increased during wind streaks. Records conflict whether that static resulted from atmospheric conditions or a low battery warning, since maintenance receipts showed his backup pack expired weeks earlier. On January 10th, Cole wrote that distant lights shimmered near the flow line and faded before his second measurement, a detail some locals claimed matched fishing vessel activity, although no Coast Guard summary listed traffic that evening. The next line in the notebook reported a low groan under the ice far from town, an acoustic echo documented in NOAA baseline data during shifting tides. Cole's tone remained detached and observant, avoiding emotional descriptions and instead referencing archived seismic tables for small cracks. His final complete sentence that day asked whether the hydrophone station southward still relayed signals, a question investigators never confirmed through equipment diagnostics. On January 11th, Cole failed to check in through routine Channel 2 frequency. A coworker named Deborah Mills, age 42 biologist, said she attempted radio contact at 9 and 10 in the morning without response. She then contacted station management, who reviewed dispatch logs and noted Cole last keyed his handset near the coastal berm. A county snow machine unit launched around noon, scanning drift patterns that reportedly shifted overnight due to westerly gusts. Searchers traced faint boot impressions leading north toward the icefoot, then losing them near an uneven ridge where brine seep froze into hard crystals. Radio pings from Cole's device failed to return, raising doubts about battery life or signal interference from pressure ridges. State records indicated no major storm that morning, yet archived notes from a weather observer mentioned sudden haze forming along the horizon. Some locals claimed they heard a single sharp ice crack around sunrise, though investigators never confirmed source timing. The notebook ended abruptly after January 10th entries, with the 12th page blank except for a graphite smudge that forensic technicians could not match to nearby strokes. County file from 2009 recorded similar smudge patterns in another coastal disappearance attributed to glove friction, although that earlier individual returned after 6 hours. Cole never returned, leaving equipment bag and anchor spikes behind near a flagged post. Responders cataloged every item, sealing them under evidence protocol and storing them in Anchorage. Cole's radio remained tuned to the standard research channel when recovered, volume medium-high, battery completely depleted according to hardware report. The receiving station log recorded static bursts during the morning gap, times matching tidal shift near second channel breakwater. Investigators considered whether frost buildup blocked antenna range, a known seasonal issue that technicians tried mitigating using heated covers. Some locals claimed they saw vehicle lights near the airport during search hours, though that detail held no link to Cole's route, according to State Review. Later interviews with Mills emphasized Cole's cautious habits, despite some suggestions he wandered beyond mapped safe points. She stated he often referenced archived notes to ensure reliable measurement routines, quoting older baseline tables from 2011 and earlier. Records conflict on whether he reported minor dizziness during cold snaps, as one email thread referenced fatigue, while another denied health concerns. Cole never filed leave requests, and his medical form indicated no chronic issues. A month after the disappearance, regional officers revisited the shoreline and documented ice shifts, noting fissures wider than field logs predicted. NOAA records showed barometric dips during late January, patterns capable of influencing ice pressure and sound transmission. The investigating team reviewed satellite radar scans to identify surface deformation, though resolution limits prevented certainty. Some locals claimed they saw a dark shape moving along the floe days later, a claim investigators never confirmed through wildlife camera pulls. Official conclusion listed probable hypothermia near unstable ice sections, a determination consistent with coastal research fatalities elsewhere in Arctic regions. No body surfaced despite thaw season, sweeps, and gear remnants remained stored under state authority. County records listed case inactive but unresolved, pending future evidence or remains discovery. Archived notes from internal review committees emphasized radio maintenance gaps and recommended dual patrol policies. The logbook itself raised questions among analysts, especially lines referencing low-frequency resonance and fading lights near the horizon. Marine acoustics specialists acknowledged that ice sheets often create harmonic tones during freeze expansion, phenomena documented in northern field journals. Yet handwriting review found slight tremor in final entries, raising hypotheses about cold exposure or glove stiffness. Some locals claimed Cole heard distant machinery, though investigators never confirmed any offshore activity. Through subsequent winters, technicians continued surveys near Barrow Station following updated safety protocols that required partner travel and beacon checks. Dispatch logs now documented hourly confirmations, reducing gaps present during Cole's final assignment period. State records noted no repeat disappearance in years since, though internal memos still cited Cole's case during seasonal briefings. Archived notes in training binders referenced his name beside cold weather guidelines, reinforcing adherence to check-in rules. In absence of confirmed remains or additional entries, the logbook stayed the primary record of his final hours. The writing remained steady until abrupt cessation, leaving investigators with ice pressure data and vague references to distant lights. Records conflict whether those lights came from distant research, craft, or atmospheric mirage, since winter inversions near Utqiagvik occasionally distort visibility. The notebook rested in a secure vault cited in state literature about Arctic risk management. Visitors to Utqiagvik sometimes asked old residents about Cole, and responses shifted between cautionary tone and plain factual retelling. Some locals claimed stray radio static persisted at the shoreline during certain winds, though communications reports never verified interference significance. The county file from 2009 noted public interest spikes during tourist seasons, yet official channels kept measured language. Cole's name remained printed in field rosters and advisory bulletins, his logbook a reminder of precise observation amid uncertain ice fields. Stories like this sit between datasheets and winter ground truth, where radio checks meet drifting snow and pressure ridges reset landscapes overnight. Cole's measured notes followed standard scientific phrasing, his attention fixed on ice patterns and environmental shifts. Reportedly, a small memorial marker sits near the research building, foyer listing his service dates and assignment record. The case stayed open in memory and procedure rather than active search, grounded in documented logs and unanswered observations. The stories. Why this abandoned cabin had alleged proof in drywall. The story kept circling a single point about an empty cabin and a word written behind drywall. People called it proof. They did not agree on what it proved, but they repeated the word until it sounded heavy. Renata Vale was 36 and worked as a county property assessor who handled delinquent parcels. She drove a faded sedan, kept a folder of index cards, and listened to dispatch traffic. On a late spring morning, she headed to a decommissioned fishing road where a tax sale cabin sat empty. Her goal was simple and boring, which was to document storm damage before the auction and verify the interior. The cabin stood near a shallow creek with boards turned gray and a porch sag bent toward the dirt. A rusted mailbox leaned near the gate, with paint scabbed off and a number grit filmed over. Renata took photos for the file. Then she checked the back door where a hasp hung, but the lock was missing. She logged the broken hardware as prior damage, then stepped inside while the floor pressed its complaint. The incident began as a sound that did not fit the room, and then a sight. A sheet of drywall in the front room had a patch that sounded hollow when tapped. The panel was bright white against tobacco walls, and 4 black screws sat too straight and clean. She noted a faint dust halo around the joint compound, which looked newer than the rest by many years. She started a routine sweep while recording voice notes to keep the chain of events tidy. The stove held a nest of brittle twigs, the fridge was gone, and a thin mattress lay folded. Renata kept moving and counted outlets, then paused at the patched panel again. Her notes said the sheet brand looked like a type common after 2010, not the 1980s era expected here. 2 neighbors drifted by while she worked and gave versions that agreed on mood, not detail. A ranch hand named Cleo Vargas recalled sirens and smoke from 1998 when a fire line whipped through. Cleo said a man who stayed here left in a hurry and never came back, and people held a fundraiser that winter. A grocer named Benito Lake remembered men in a county truck replacing a little window about 2012, though he admitted the year could be off. Renata took their names, then asked if anyone else checked the cabin in recent years. Cleo said an insurance adjuster came by after a windstorm, and Cleo believed the woman filed a report and sealed the door. Benito said a teenager broke in 2 summers later, then a deputy taped a notice and told kids to stay away. Renata wrote both recollections as witness statements with the usual caveats about memory. She returned to the panel and looked for a reason a patch would be that clean inside this neglected shell. The screws were square drive, which was common for newer fasteners, and the spacing suggested a single small repair. The joint compound had been sanded poorly and left a telltale crescent above the seam. She ran a small flashlight along the edge and found a hair-thin line that was not paint. Her job did not include prying open walls without cause, so she called her supervisor and explained the condition. He told her to capture more context and check permits, then hold off on any invasive step until the records search. Renata agreed and left the cabin to sit with her laptop in the car while the creek talked its small talk. The county database was a stubborn thing that offered results if you knew how to ask without being greedy. She entered the parcel number and found a series of tax liens followed by a default. The permit history showed 2 entries worth attention. First, a window replacement request filed 2011, then a drywall materials purchase noted by a grant program 2015. The second entry surprised her, since the grant was designed for weatherization, not interior repairs. She cross-checked the vendor list and saw a receipt from a hardware store 3 towns away. The purchase line item said half-sheet gypsum and screws, with a date in early summer 2015. A note mentioned a volunteer crew and a case number from the sheriff office. Renata paused and rechecked the address to make sure she was not mixing properties. She downloaded everything, then called the sheriff records clerk and asked if the case number could be viewed. The clerk said the report was open public information because it involved property maintenance hours completed after a welfare check. The description said a deputy supervised a group that boarded a back window and patched a hole where a wood stove pipe had been. The deputy name was listed as J. Kravitz. With a badge number and a contact line, Renata called the number and reached a retired deputy, who answered his phone with a dry voice and correct dates. He remembered standing in that cabin while a volunteer placed a sheet over a hole, and he remembered the neighbors bringing lemonade. He also remembered boys laughing because someone had drawn a cartoon in dust above the refrigerator space. Renata thanked him and asked if any record included interior photos from that day that could be released. Kravitz said he took 3, which he felt comfortable sharing if the clerk confirmed the release path. The email reached her 10 minutes later, with 3 small images showing a too-clean patch, a bent stovepipe, and a blank wall. The timestamp read 2015, with an hour that matched late afternoon shadows. Renata zoomed in and saw the same screw pattern she had just seen in person. She returned inside with a copy of the email printed, which satisfied her need for a pre-image before touching anything. She recorded a video on her county phone, then gently ran a utility blade along the painted seam and loosened the small patch. The square drive screws turned with almost no resistance and dropped into her pocket. The board came free and showed the backside marked with pencil lines. There were 2 words in block print near the center, and a string of numbers that looked like miles or hours or both. The words read, "Tell Mara," then below them a date in words that matched late summer 2015. A thin arrow pointed toward the upper corner, where someone had tucked a sealed plastic bag with a micro SD card. Renata did not touch the bag, since she already had more than enough cause to stop and phone this in. She stepped back and spoke to her phone, as if it were a witness who needed comfort rather than patience. She said she had an evidentiary find, likely tied to a case report from 2015, and she described the board condition. She then called her supervisor and said she would hold position and request a deputy to document chain of custody. Her voice felt steady, which helped, and the creak still talked. The responding deputy arrived from the nearest substation and followed a familiar script at a deliberate pace. He photographed the panel, bagged the micro SD card, then requested a second unit to confirm signatures. He also asked Renata to repeat her steps for his body camera, which she did, and her voice stayed calm. He wrote "Tell Mara" in his notebook and underlined the date, then asked about any person by that name in the area. Cleo returned when he saw the cruiser and stood at the fence with a careful expression that suggested curiosity and worry. He said a woman named Mara used to work at the gas station near the highway, and she moved inland after the big fire. He believed she dated the man who once stayed at this cabin, whose name people rarely said anymore. Cleo said the man had a brother who fought with him over debt, which was rumor, and old rumor at that. Renata kept the witness statement straight and did not chase speculation, because theory makes friendly noise but muddies facts. The deputy asked dispatch to check archived calls around late summer 2015 for any mention of the station or the creek. Dispatch later replied that an incomplete emergency call pinged a tower near the old highway with a man's voice saying "wrong truck" before the line died. The call was never connected again, and the dispatch note listed a response that found nothing conclusive on the road. The investigators gathered all of this and began to lay a clean map of what the drywall might mean. The board was patched during a small volunteer day led by Deputy Kravitz, who remembered no note then because the drywall face was clean. The writing was on the backside, so whoever wrote "Tell Mara" likely wrote before installation or wrote during installation and then faced the board inward. The micro SD card fit the same logic, since it had to be tucked away before final screws. The sheriff tech opened the bag carefully and previewed the card on a laptop while Renata stood near the doorway. The card held a few small files and one audio clip that was less than a minute long, with a man breathing hard. A voice said "Mara." Then there was a scrape sound. Then the voice said, "Wrong truck? Check mile marker 12. Then silence. The text said the file metadata matched a late summer date, 2015, which matched the pencil note. The deputy asked Benito about mile 12, and Benito said a vanished reflector stood near a turnout everyone used for tire chains. He said the place was not on maps, but everyone knew it by a crooked pine and a faded mile stencil. A second unit drove there and found an old-cut bank with broken bottles and a rusted number plate choked by vines. That team then called for a grid walk and a metal sweep, which turned up a torn piece of a license frame County records later produced an abandoned truck report filed by a salvage yard in early fall 2015. The report said a pickup had been moved by a private tow from a turnout before a storm and later sold for parts. The tow ticket listed a different mile marker by mistake, likely copied wrong by the driver, and the ticket names were hard to read. The salvage manager admitted their clerk sometimes took shortcuts with paperwork when storms crowded the yard. A detective interviewed the retired tow driver and asked for his memory of the pickup and its condition after the call. The driver said he remembered an empty truck with a broken rear glass and a tarp inside that smelled like gasoline. He said two men met him at the turnout and pointed to a path, and he signed a work order that he no longer had. He said he remembered a gold wedding band on a chain near the shifter, which he placed in a cup holder out of caution. The audio clip and the drywall note nudged the case from rumor to a timeline that had context and checkable waypoints. The incomplete call in 2015 used the words "wrong truck," which matched the audio and echoed through dispatch records. The mild repair day in 2015 created a perfect stage for a message that only a future visitor might find. The instruction "Tell Mara" suggested the writer knew a specific person would eventually hear about the cabin again. Renata learned that temp crews sometimes used whatever board they had in the truck, which could explain the face-inward mistake. A volunteer might have grabbed a sheet with a pencil note from the stack without thinking, then installed it with the note hidden. Another possibility was that the writer meant to hide the message, assuming a person who cared would eventually come prying. Both options fit the facts, and neither required creative leaps that could not be defended in a report. A second pass through the micro SD card revealed a photo of a dashboard with a gas station logo seen through the windshield. The date stamp matched the summer of 2015, and the triangle logo was the old brand used before a sale. Benito confirmed that the station repainted their canopy that autumn, which inadvertently confirmed the window of time. The detail felt small and almost petty, yet it anchored the sequence to a real week. The detective contacted the station owner, who produced archived night logs showing a purchase by a prepaid card at 11:42. A print from the receipt showed a pack of ice and a cheap burner phone that matched the model seen in the photo. The clerk on duty had long since moved, though a manager remembered a man who returned twice that night to borrow tape. He said he thought the man looked scraped up, and he remembered a truck with a blue fender and a white tailgate. A family member of the man who stayed at the cabin identified the voice on the audio as a high likelihood match. They provided an older voicemail that had similar breathing patterns when the man climbed hills for fun on weekends. The sheriff office sent both clips to a regional lab, which returned a cautious report that said the two voices were likely related. The lab kept the language safe, which made sense because certainty in audio work is often impossible. The drywall word itself caused arguments in corners where the story traveled faster than any memo could hope to move. People liked the part where the house was silent for years while a small message waited for a careful hand. Some said the word proof made sense because the voice was clearly him, and because the date matched the summer when he vanished. Others said proof is for courtrooms and journals, and this was only a lead until tested. Renata held her own view, which was that houses keep small time capsules without meaning to, and sometimes that matters. She had seen children's names carved into baseboards under carpet and grocery lists folded under a sink. She had also seen unsafe wiring stuffed into a cereal box and tucked inside a wall, and the box told its own story. People leave messages wherever they can, hoping someone decent will listen someday when it counts. The case shifted again when a trail crew found a piece of a phone shell near mile marker 11 during a separate survey. The shell matched the burner model bought that night, and nearby crews found a patch of old stain on the soil. A lab swab reported that the residue was fuel, which was consistent with the tow driver memory of gasoline smell in the truck. A chain of steps formed that linked the turnout, the audio clip, and the tow yard path. Mara was located by a social worker who knew 3 different last names for her from utility records. She met with investigators in a room that smelled like coffee, that had been reheated many times and left to think. She said she had not heard from him since that summer, and she cried in a way that was lightless but dry. When told about the drywall note, she put her head down and whispered that he tried to fix things and always left notes. She agreed to listen to the clip, then nodded and said the words were his when he felt cornered by debt and fear. She said wrong truck made sense because his brother drove a similar model and people mixed them up when angry. She said mile 12 meant the turnout where they used to watch road crews because he loved slow machines more than sleep. She asked if the word proof meant she could stop imagining him as a ghost in every passing pickup. The detective did not promise anything, which was the right call, and said the message mattered more than rumor. Mara said that was good enough for now and asked if she could visit the cabin to see the panel with her own eyes. Renata met her there with Cleo and Benito nearby, and they all stood quiet while the creek kept talking. Mara touched the pencil words like a fingertip prayer, then laughed once, small and sudden, because the handwriting was his. The county eventually sold the parcel to a quiet bidder who planned to reclaim lumber and leave the footprint for a garden. Before the sale, the sheriff office returned the panel to the property with a sealed sleeve that covered the message. A small plaque nailed to a beam recorded the date in words and the name of the deputy who first supervised repairs. It did not use the word proof, which felt right, because the wall was more than a verdict. Reporters asked Renata if she believed the drywall solved anything that mattered, and she answered with careful honesty and patience. She said it solved whether the cabin hid a message, and it offered a direction for facts to continue breathing. She said the board changed a rumor cloud into a line of checkable points that connected people who had waited years. She also said that what you call proof depends on the room you are standing in and the weight on your heart. The story kept circulating, and people kept walking that turnout and counting the faded stencils with respect and quiet. They looked for signs that someone had tried to speak in a tight corner and had chosen an odd messenger. They bent close to drywall, then stepped back and saw a small room that finally felt less like a tomb. They understood that time can hide a message, and sometimes the wall just needs a steady hand and a simple blade. When Renata thinks about the cabin now, she remembers the hush when the board came free and the pencil marks appeared. She remembers Cleo and Benito telling careful pieces and retired Deputy Kravitz recalling lemonade in a little paper cup. She remembers that proof is a rough word for a gentle thing, which is a voice asking someone to tell a person named Mara. She believes the house did what houses sometimes do, which is hold a note until the right listener finally arrives. The disappearance of the highway patrolman near Ash Fork. A winter front moved across the high mesas west of Williams when a patrol unit stopped near Ash Fork on the interstate shoulder. The first call to county dispatch described a parked cruiser with lights flicking in windblown grit and no visible officer nearby. The officer was David Keller, 39 highway patrolman, assigned to traffic enforcement along the corridor between Seligman and Williams that week. He left the substation after a routine briefing about black ice formations reported by truckers along shaded cuts east of town. His stated purpose, according to state records, was to monitor a construction taper set along a narrow bridge approach near mile marker 264. The cruiser camera showed lane markers bending through frost and snow feathers moving like powder from the plow ridges. The microphone captured only windrush and an ignition idle that shifted pitch as the alternator compensated for light bar draw. Maria Ortega, 47, long-haul driver, was hauling insulated produce toward Kingman after picking up palletized freight in Flagstaff near dawn. Her log noted a slowdown near the Ash Fork interchange and a trooper unit angled behind a stranded sedan with hazard lights. She reportedly saw a figure in a dark jacket walk from the cruiser toward the guardrail where the shoulder turned to brush. Her statement, filed that night, added that drifting spindrift obscured the figure almost immediately after the door shut. She did not stop because a second unit was expected based on advisory messages that reached her cab radio. Dispatch logs for that afternoon reference Keller advising a plate check on an older sedan with temporary tags that did not match the make. The recorded time, taken from console entries, put the event near 9:15 as the snow intensified around Low Scrub Hills. A reply from records confirmed a mismatch that required a further stop review under procedure regarding possible fraudulent registration display. Traffic camera frames captured the sedan signal across the taper before easing into the shoulder where cones began. The sedan position remained consistent across several frames until a burst of powder erased details beyond the guardrail. Archived notes from the local maintenance yard describe a temporary drop in visibility near the bridge over Partridge Creek during mid-morning. A crew foreman wrote that crosswinds from the north pushed powder through the taper and rattled plastic drums against the barrier ends. Those notes mentioned a lone cruiser parked short of the bridge nose, with the driver door open wider than expected in such wind. The yard memo carried no conclusion about the patrol activity, only an instruction to reposition drums once visibility returned. The author of the memo later said he believed the trooper waved him through while attending to the sedan driver. State records list Keller as a 9-year veteran with prior wildfire support experience and winter operations training completed during 2 recent seasons. He qualified on roadside risk protocols that included 3-point positioning of flares, with an emphasis on avoiding smoke recoil near fuel vapors. Training outlines suggest he would be unlikely to leave his engine running without attention for longer than a few minutes during a live stop. The cruiser computer recorded multiple authentication pings, which indicates the engine remained on while the unit computer stayed awake. Investigators never confirmed whether door sensors captured an accurate timeline, since the harness connector had intermittent faults noted earlier that month. A ranch hand named Luke Porter, 32, seasonal worker, crossed the frontage road to check drifting across his gate while winds pushed snow into shallow dunes. He later told deputies that the sedan driver leaned on the guardrail and smoked while the trooper spoke on the radio. Porter described the driver as medium height with a bright scarf, though he admitted distance, snow glare, and wind made everything seem grainy. Some locals claimed the scarf detail belonged to a different sighting on a different day, and records conflict on the time. Porter insisted the memory fixed around the sound of a freight horn rolling across the draws east of town. At midday, the construction taper crew returned from a salt run and found the sedan door ajar against the rail, scuffed by spindrift. The car interior held a coffee cup, a glove, and a folded paper map soaked at the creases by driven snow. County deputies found the keys under the driver's seat and a registration stub that matched a plate number different from the displayed tag. The county file from 2009 includes a guidance form about counterfeit temporary tags that investigators cited during the first briefing. They towed the sedan to the yard while a search team worked the brush south of the bridge where cattails lay crushed in wind lanes. The cruiser remained on the shoulder, with the light bar switching through patterns as the battery bus dipped under alternating loads. A second unit arrived and found the radio on local repeat and the shotgun still locked in its bracket under the console. The driver's seat carried Keller's jacket, and his hat rested brim down on the passenger floor as if placed there to avoid wind. Boot prints led from the driver door toward the rail and then along the barrier toward the creek bed cut by winter flow. The prints doubled back once, then broke apart where powder filled the depressions and obscured direction near chaparral that clung to the slope. Searchers followed the creek line downstream toward the junction where ice forms brittle shelves shaded by basalt outcrops. They flagged scuffs that might be boot scrapes against rock ledges and found a small light clipped to a vest strap under a snow lip. The light belonged to Keller based on an engraved initial, though the battery showed charge and the clicker worked without failure. A glove liner lay 7 strides away, and a plastic evidence ruler set in photographs showed a consistent tread shape in compressed powder. The pattern matched the department-issue boot ranked for winter operations, which gave confidence for a concentrated sweep along the left bank. During the afternoon, Maria Ortega delivered her trailer to a Kingman yard and returned to speak with investigators about the scarf and the smoking driver. She said the driver stood still, as if bracing against wind while keeping the cigarette cupped, a habit she recognized from mountain passes. Her recollection placed Keller between the driver and the cruiser, with his shoulder radio lifted toward his face near the guardrail posts. Investigators never confirmed a radio transmission during that precise moment because a repeater outage occurred when power fluctuations hit the tower. That outage appears in utility reports and in dispatch logs that reference brief static bursts followed by dead air and reset signals. A wildlife officer named Eli Warren, 58, retired wildfire crew and seasonal ranger, joined the search along the creek meanders after volunteers formed grids. He knew runoff channels around Ash Fork from years of mapping nesting sites before spring and recognized several sink pockets that collect powder after wind events. Warren found a patch where snow seemed scooped in an oval and pressed by a heavy form sliding downslope from the rail. He marked the spot and radioed, then followed a short skid toward brush where a torn cuff rested under a juniper limb. The cuff stitching matched Keller's uniform issue based on a later lab note included with photographs and chain of custody forms. Archive notes from a prior winter mention a similar drift pocket that formed under a jumping wind at that same bend near the bridge turn. A plow foreman described how cars could appear to settle into a whiteout while only yards away from bare gravel strips. The note advised units to overrun the cone line and stop farther past the bridge nose to avoid the funneling gusts through the guardrail posts. Keller's vehicle position, marked in spray paint after the tow, sat just within the funnel sector described by the maintenance memo. Whether he knew the risk is unknown, though his training files include a section on wind eddies around barrier terminations. State records show several calls from travelers reporting a figure walking the median hours after the initial stop near Ash Fork. One call suggested the figure carried a bright cloth that whipped in the wind and then vanished behind a salt truck spray. Another caller described a uniformed person moving along the barrier and then crouching between drums as a semi passed with slush boost. Investigators ran those reports against lane camera frames, but could not align the timestamps with known truck movements recorded by the way station. The mismatch left a gap that investigators noted without drawing conclusions, because records conflict across sources and clocks drifted during the outage. Late light washed the draws as a helicopter searched with a thermal unit that read the landscape in pale washes of heat and shadow. The camera picked up coyotes moving single file and a herd of pronghorns scattered across a fence gap south of the interstate. No human heat bloom appeared along the creek banks, where teams marked probable flow paths between junipers and basalt shelves. At dusk, the teams withdrew as temperature fell and a clear sky promised a hard freeze over the drift pockets. A deputy stayed with the cruiser as a tow prepared for removal, and a tarp covered the windshield to protect interior prints. The sedan owner, contacted through registration files, lived in Mohave County and reported the plates stolen during summer before the snow season. He said he sold the car 2 weeks earlier to a buyer who paid cash and took the vehicle without a name entered on the title. The description given by the seller did not match the figure Maria recalled near the guardrail smoking through the wind. Investigators never confirmed whether the buyer and the driver were the same person because the transaction lacked a recorded bill of sale. A later inquiry noted small drill marks near the plate bracket that suggested a quick swap performed without care for alignment. Some locals claimed a patrolman once warned about a narrow step near the rail where the fill slumped during heavy thaw years ago. The county road book included an entry about that settle with a recommendation for riprap that budget delays postponed beyond another season. Snow filled the depression in layers as wind drove crystals against the rail and then into the low along the slope. A person stepping from the shoulder could slide, lose balance, and strike brush before arresting on a shelf near the creek bend. Searchers tested that route and found scraped bark, small threads of uniform cloth, and granular ice chips stuck to the fabric. The last confirmed radio position for Keller triangulated near the bridge nose using signal strength from 2 towers before the repeater outage rolled through. A technician later explained that strength readings mislead during ground refraction under cold inversions over the mesas. The estimate still set him within a short walk of the cruiser at the time Maria saw the jacketed figure by the guardrail. That alignment supports the view that he had not walked far before. Snow and wind obscured his path across the drift pocket. Whether he pursued the driver on foot or stepped away to inspect the sedan underside remained unsettled after weeks of review. The county file from 2009 contains a checklist for cold weather searches that the sheriff cited when expanding the grid into the draws. The list emphasizes boot impressions in powder and the capture of small textile fragments where brush scrapes occur along narrow paths. Teams returned over several days and documented scattered impressions that led nowhere once sun crusted the surface and wind reset the field. A scarf fragment appeared near a cattail stand and matched no clothing from Keller's locker or department inventory logged at the substation. Some locals claimed it proved the driver moved along the creek line, though investigators never confirmed a full scarf from the fragment alone. In the following week, the snow receded along south faces, while shaded pockets kept their stiff crusts under cedar boughs. Maintenance crews removed the taper and set a warning board about drifting near the rail gap by the bridge nose. The patrol cruiser remained off-duty as lab teams worked the interior and finally returned it to the yard behind a chain-link fence. State records note that Keller's radio keyed several times after the outage cleared, though no voice transmissions followed those key events. Technicians attributed the signals to automated resets and not to manual use, a conclusion recorded after firmware inspections at the communications shop. Several archived notes, reference calls from hikers along a section of old roadbed west of Ash Fork where cinders surface in thin patches. They reported finding a badge clip near a juniper, though the badge itself was absent and the clip showed corrosion from prior seasons. Investigators marked the find as uncertain due to lack of provenance and possible placement by wind or by animal movement across Camp Detritus. That entry sits beside a note about a lunch receipt found in brush near the bridge, a receipt that matched Keller's purchase from a Williams diner. The receipt time falls within the morning window and supports his presence on the route earlier than the stop near the taper. Months later, runoff deepened the creek and exposed stones where snow once stacked and preserved shallow marks along the slope. A volunteer team found a radio cord near a root snag, its plug scuffed and the insulation cut by a sharp edge. The department radio in Keller's cruiser still carried its cord, which made the creek find a likely unrelated item from unknown origin. Some locals claimed it showed parts shed in a struggle, yet investigators never confirmed a second radio issued to Keller that winter. The find joined a small shelf of objects in the evidence room with tags that read uncertain and deferred pending future comparison tests. Records conflict on the final sighting time because different calls reached the sheriff line and the highway line as power returned in uneven blocks. A tourist bus reported a figure in reflective trousers east of the interchange, walking against traffic with an arm raised toward a plow. Another traveler said a uniformed man stood behind drums and waved a flashlight below waist level near the bridge nose. Neither sighting aligned with camera frames due to snow sheets over the lenses and abrupt exposure shifts when trucks passed. The investigative summary notes that conflicting timelines, complicated verification, and left sequence uncertainties that never closed despite successive interviews. The official notice lists David Keller as missing while off the shoulder of the interstate near Ash Fork during a winter weather event. The notice states he exited his vehicle during a stop involving a sedan with mismatched registration and did not return to the cruiser. It also states that search operations covered the creek line, the brush slopes, and the construction taper area with negative results beyond clothing fragments. The write-up includes references to dispatch logs, to state records, to archived notes, and to the county file. From 2009, the final line records that investigators never confirmed a route of travel or conclusive contact with any identified driver from the sedan. The bridge approaches now carry riprap under the rail where the settle once formed a shallow step hidden by wind and snow powder. A small marker for a generic safety reminder sits near the shoulder where the view opens toward distant hills and a thin band of pines. Drivers pass with steady speed, and the wind still pulls through the guardrail posts and rattles the plastic drums when storms cross the mesas. Some locals claimed a trooper lights the shoulder during those storms, and a flicker rides the spindrift before sliding into the draw. The remark appears in several informal statements, and investigators never confirmed any source beyond reflection and powder-crossing headlight beams. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The guard wrote down 8 distinct bouts of footsteps inside an empty building, and the cameras showed nothing all night. 2 separate motion sensors tripped near the same hallway, yet playback displayed a silent corridor with only the exit sign glow. His name was Barrett Lorme, 42, a night security officer at a regional logistics hub off a county road. The building sat between a rail spur and a belt of trees, and the company shipped auto parts and appliances. Barrett worked the 10 to 6 shift in a brown uniform that always smelled faintly of dust and coffee. He carried a flashlight, a radio, and a phone that hooked into a dispatch line, and he liked the quiet. He had a simple goal that Tuesday night in early spring, finish his rounds and sign off incident-free by dawn. He had brought a thermos of soup and a paperback, planning to spend the downtime in the small control room. He checked the weather and watched rain move in thin sheets across the lot lights. He thought about replacing his shoes, since the tread had started to squeal on polished tile. The incident started just after midnight, when he heard measured steps across the second-floor mezzanine. He was finishing a log entry about a storm alert, and the sound came clean and steady through the ceiling. He checked camera feeds for the mezzanine, but the screens showed still aisles and palleted boxes. He grabbed his light and his radio, and he headed for the stairs with the practiced calm of routine. At the mezzanine, he found that familiar quiet hum from the conveyors, a noise that never truly stopped. The footsteps repeated behind him, like someone matching his pace near the rail that overlooked receiving. He pivoted fast, saw only empty air and a red light blinking on a camera dome. He walked the length of the aisle while noting the time, and every time he paused, the steps seemed to pause. He logged the first occurrence at 12:15, wrote down the location, and continued his route. On the next pass, he heard them again near the battery storage closet, crisp against the concrete. He spoke into his radio, more for procedure than comfort, and announced that he was investigating a possible trespass. He found the closet locked and the seal unbroken, which did not help his nerves. From the control room, recordings later showed a hallway with nothing but reflected light pooling against steel doors. The microphones in that area were old and tinny, yet they caught a faint rhythm that matched walking. The time code on the feed read 12:18, which matched his scribbled note from the clipboard. He wrote a second entry because repeated anomalies meant paperwork, and paperwork meant patience. By 1:20, the steps had moved to the long corridor past the break room, and Barrett felt the hairs rise on his arms. He had switched to his backup flashlight after the primary started to flicker, which made the hallway feel longer. He called dispatch on the archived line and requested a patrol swing through the outer lot, which sounded more confident than he felt. The dispatcher logged it and told him to stay on channel, which he did while walking slow. Around 2, the rain intensified, and the roof drums sent soft rolls through the rafters that sounded like distant carts. Barrett tried to isolate the sound by standing still, counting under his breath, then moving again. The footsteps returned with the same cadence each time, never rushing, never trailing off, like a metronome following his heel. He marked the third and fourth occurrences, and the sheet started to look like a pattern. He started to reconstruct the history of the building in his head in that practical way that guards do when bored. The hub had been expanded twice, and the mezzanine had been added after the original slab settled. A retired manager once said the second floor carried sound, strangely because the joists had been spliced during a shutdown. That small detail stuck now because odd structure often equals odd sound, and odd sound confuses cameras. He decided on an internal check of maintenance records, so he dug into a filing cabinet near the back wall. He found a binder labeled Floor Vibration Studies, stamped with a date from 2009 and signed by an engineer. He skimmed line items and saw mention of a resonance under certain loads and a recommended brace that was never installed. He took a photo on his phone, more habit than plan, then heard the steps again behind the door. He opened the door fast and swung the light through dust and metal shelves, and nothing moved. He stepped inside, closed the door, and waited until the air felt heavier, then walked, which pulled the sound along like a shadow. He spoke low into his radio and said, "Test." And he heard a soft reply through the ceiling that sounded like his own voice. He marked the fifth occurrence, then circled the time twice because the echo trick felt wrong. Barrett called the shift supervisor at home, a man named Gilles, and left a calm message. He explained that sensors popped twice, cameras showed clear, but audio suggested movement that matched his pace. He asked permission to halt one conveyor and test the mezzanine with the motor silent, since noise masking can complicate readings. He set the phone down and sipped soup while rain hit the window like static. The lot patrol rolled in at 2:30, and a deputy named Ames checked doors with a bright light and gentle humor. Ames wore a jacket that looked older than the car, and he liked to tease Barrett about hobby detective work. He came inside, listened near the break room, and heard the steps when Barrett moved, then nodded like a man hearing an old song. He wrote a short note on a card and suggested they check the time sync on the cameras. Barrett pulled up the system configuration, and a small detail finally jumped out where he had not looked. The network video recorder had synced to a time source that shifted during a recent firmware update. The correct setting had moved to a secondary tab, and the cameras were drifting a minute and a half slow during overnight resets. He compared timestamps against the dispatch call log, and the mismatch explained one gap, but not all gaps. He pulled out old handheld footage from training drills, which he kept on a thumb drive for new hires. A clip from 2019 showed a tour up the same staircase on a quiet Sunday night. The trainer had mentioned that the mezzanine acted like a drum when a person moved near the expansion joint. In the background, steps mirrored the instructor in perfect time, and the camera, pointed into the void, recorded nothing but sound. Witness statements from shipping staff added another layer. Since people love to tell small tech stories when asked kindly, a forklift driver said the mezzanine cameras had been moved 2 years earlier after a near miss with a swinging hoist. The new angles covered the rails and aisles, but created a narrow dead zone where a parapet shadow swallowed detail. The guard had never noticed because no one had reported anything in that exact strip. At 3:15, Barrett and Ames did a careful test. Treating the building like a patient with a stubborn cough, Barrett walked 5 paces, paused, walked 5, paused, and Ames watched monitors and marked everything on a yellow pad. The audio track caught consistent taps that matched the shoes, and the video showed an empty frame right where the parapet shadow lived. The dead zone was only 3 feet wide, yet it covered the spot where the resonance amplified best. They tried the same thing with the conveyor powered down, and the pattern grew clearer and less masked. Without the motor hum, the sound felt sharper, as if the building had pulled back a curtain, yet the frame still looked clean. Ames snapped his fingers and said, "That right there is our ghost. If a ghost paid rent and liked stairs." Barrett smiled without meaning to, then told him he would still file the incident by the book. He went back to the maintenance binder and took a second photo of a page about a brace that was never installed. The engineer had recommended a crossmember at the joint to dampen a known frequency that matched walking strides. In one margin, someone had written a note about budget carryover that probably killed the fix with a shrug. He put that in his notes with a plain line that said, "Brace never added, resonance persists during light traffic." The sixth occurrence came while he wrote that sentence. Like the building wanted to underline the point, he recorded the time, then cross-checked it against the corrected system time on the recorder, and they finally aligned. He realized the worst part was not the sound, but the way uncertainty stretched time during long nights. He spoke aloud to the empty hallway and said, "That is enough now," which felt silly but oddly steadying. He kept investigating because good habits make future nights easier, which matters more than a single scare. He printed the camera layout and traced the dead zone with a highlighter, then labeled each motion sensor with its field of view. He checked battery dates because a dying sensor can behave like a jumpy cat, and both batteries were fresh from last month. He called the day supervisor and left a second message with a tighter summary. The seventh and eighth occurrences happened as a pair near 4, right when shift change trucks started rumbling past the fence line. The steps matched his route exactly. Yet the sound slid forward and backward based on where he stood near the rail. He pictured the mezzanine as a guitar body that needed a finger pressed lightly on a string to quiet a note. He thought about the brace again, and he made a final note that felt like an instruction. When Gilles called back just before 5, Barrett kept his tone normal and direct. Gilles asked if he needed an officer to sit inside until the sun came up, and Barrett said they were fine now. He explained the misaligned timestamps and the dead zone shadow and the resonance sheet that read like a forgotten to-do. Gilles sighed, then said to write it clean and attach the photos to the morning inbox. Barrett did that line by line, treating the log as a small map for the next person. He wrote that witnesses heard the sound during training in 2019 and that maintenance had never added the brace. He wrote that the camera angles needed a minor shift to close the dead zone near the parapet. He added that the network recorder needed a corrected time source to prevent drift during overnight resets. He included a note about the patrol deputy who observed the sound and saw clean frames. Because outside eyes help, he kept the language careful and dry, avoiding drama, sticking to facts he could show later without wobble. He attached phone photos of the binder pages, the highlighted camera layout, and his clipboard entries that matched the sensor alerts. He finished by recommending a temporary closure of the area until the brace could be installed. Sunrise cleaned the edges of everything, and the building felt ordinary again, which was a relief he did not say. The rain slowed, and a gull rode the wind over the rail spur, which made him laugh at himself for being jumpy. He locked the mezzanine door and placed a bright cone at the landing, because simple signals beat superstition every time. He poured the last of his soup into a paper cup and let the steam warm his nose. When the day shift filed in, Barrett handed the report to the receptionist and nodded to the warehouse lead. He told the lead to keep people off the mezzanine except for essential work, and the lead agreed with a tired salute. Ames waved from his car and drove off with the easy confidence of a man satisfied by a solvable problem. The place returned to its ordinary clatter, which was the best sound in the world that morning. In the weeks that followed, the company installed the missing brace and retuned the camera angles by a small degree. A contractor ran a new line to the time source, then logged the change and initialed the tab with a neat signature. The steps never reappeared in the same way, according to follow-up notes and archived calls from later shifts. Barrett replaced his shoes and kept working nights, because quiet had always been the goal. If anyone asked about the story, he told it straight, and he never padded the edges to make it spooky. He said that buildings remember their mistakes in the shape of their echoes, and a cheap fix can teach a loud lesson. He said that cameras can lie without malice if someone nudges their clocks or points them an inch left. He said that good logs can save an hour of fear, which felt true every time he wrote a line. By summer, the mezzanine felt like any other walkway. Not a drum, not a stage, not a mirror for footsteps. The report lived in a drawer with other small sagas of night work, each one patient and plain. Barrett liked that the truth did not need big words or legends, just careful notes and people who read them. He had found the sound and given it a reason, and the reason made the building quiet again. The sound heard across Kenai fjords. Tour boats returning to Seward after a clear morning on Resurrection Bay reported a single deep tone that rolled like distant surf, although the water lay flat and the hills carried no echo. The first report came from a 39-year-old deckhand named Mason Kerr, who worked seasonally on wildlife tours and kept a pocket notebook for weather notes. He told his captain that the tone rose through the rail like a struck bell and lasted several seconds with a faint tremor underfoot. The captain marked the time and location in the log with wind from the south and small ripples under an idle prop. Their passengers kept silent for a moment and then asked whether the sound came from a submarine near the entrance. The captain said the chart showed no restricted area that morning and the harbor office had posted no advisories for training. A 28-year-old kayak guide named Lila Torres was leading a half-day trip near Fox Island for a group of visitors from Anchorage who wanted calm water and photos. She later wrote that the tone arrived like pressure on the chest and the kayaks shivered in a tight cluster before the water went still again. She radioed a brief notice on Channel 16 and used the working channel to ask if any tour vessel was running a new horn. 2 operators answered that their horns had not sounded and that their engines were near idle with whale watching underway. Her clients asked whether glaciers made music, and she said calving usually cracked or thundered rather than hummed. Dispatch logs from the Seward Harbor office show a cluster of calls within a 10-minute window that afternoon from tour captains and one fishing skiff. The entries note a low-frequency tone heard across Eyelock Bay with no visible source and no visible spray or plume. A state trooper boat near Bear Glacier reportedly paused to check for slides and found loose, brash ice pushing against a rocky point. The crew recorded air temperature and barometer fall from morning levels and then continued a shoreline patrol toward the bay entrance. The log does not list distress or mechanical failure after the tone, and no injuries were recorded. Park staff collected statements over 2 days because visitors kept bringing the same story into the small office near the docks. A seasonal ranger named Glenn Hart, 47, kept a legal pad on his desk and asked the same 5 questions about time and direction and duration. He wrote that impressions differed on compass bearing even when groups stood together on the same deck for the same minute. He also wrote that many described a feeling in the ribs before the ears caught up, which suggested vibration through hulls and rocks. His notes described calm voices and measured pauses rather than panic or excitement. Archived notes from the Park Learning Center describe known sounds that travel far along the fjords during specific weather patterns and tide stages. Staff listed glacial calving that booms across glassy water and carries round corners when air is dense and winds are light. They also listed distant thunder from summer storms that bend around the Kenai Mountains and arrive as a soft pulse at ground level. A retired pilot contributed a comment about mountain wave activity that can press air downward and make waves slap rock faces with a sudden synchronized thud. The center added that underwater landslides produce tones that resonate in bays, yet seldom leave obvious surface traces. State records for small seismic events show no local quake at the exact minute written in the tour logs for that weekend. A technician in Anchorage compared regional instruments and found weak tremors earlier in the day that did not align with the reported tone. He suggested a subaerial rockfall into deep water could ring like a struck drum with little visible splash from a long distance. He also said steep walls near the outer bays can mask origin and send energy along submerged ledges. His memo closed with a note that further inspection would require a focused hydrophone survey and a slow pass across likely shelves. Some locals claimed the sound began near Northwestern Lagoon, where calving fronts sometimes shed slabs the size of buildings during warm spells. A charter captain countered that he saw no fresh debris lines on the tide and that seals rested undisturbed on the flows. A kayak guide said the tone felt too pure for ice and too long for a crack or a crumble. Another guide said ice can sing when air pockets collapse underwater and chambers resonate like pipes built into the bergs. Investigators never confirmed whether any glacier in the park produced a tone with the same simple character described by visitors. The county file from 2009 contains references to a similar report during an autumn.com that drew 2 patrols to the outer coastline. The file mentions a low hum heard near the mouth of Resurrection Bay while fog sat heavy over the water and engines idled. Crews found a fresh slump on a remote slope that had slipped into a pocket cove and left a curved scar above the tide line. The report notes that ice and rock mixed in the slide and that the cove deepened rapidly from the beach. That event generated no injuries and closed no areas, yet it became a lesson about hidden energy along steep shores. Mason kept writing in his notebook during the week because passengers continued to ask about the sound and whether it meant trouble for tours. He recorded wind shifts and swell periods and any unusual echo from gull cries against the cliffs. He wrote that engines at idle produced normal vibration with no overlap into the low tone they had heard on the first day. He also wrote that the crew checked bilge spaces and shaft alignment and found nothing that could carry a pure tone through the hull. His final entry for the week simply read, "No recurrence during normal routes with weather stable and visibility fair." Lila met 2 park educators near the boat ramp and answered a list of short questions that were printed for consistency across interviews. She repeated that the tone climbed through her boat before she fully heard it, which made her think of pressure more than sound. She said her clients quieted and held their paddles low as if a wake would arrive, but the water stayed nearly flat. She mentioned a faint rattle among small stones near the beach that began after the tone ended, which struck her as delayed movement. The educators thanked her and marked direction, uncertain, duration, 5 seconds quality musical, rather than percussive, with a note to verify tides. Rumors of naval testing reached the harbor within days because distant security zones sometimes appear without much notice along the Gulf. A liaison officer who stood by for public calls said no range activity had been scheduled for the recorded hour. He explained that some sonar pulses are audible to people under specific conditions, yet training avoids popular corridors during busy seasons. He added that the recorded ferry times and tour traffic would argue strongly against a scheduled run through the Baymouth. The harbor office kept his statement on file and listed it next to other letters that addressed similar concerns. A science volunteer from Fairbanks brought a portable recorder and a small hydrophone to Ayalik Bay after the first reports filled social feeds. He ran a set of drifts in quiet coves and clipped his gear to moorings while keeping notes with tide times and wind readings. The recordings captured normal boat traffic and the chewing crackle of shrimp and occasional distant rumbles from glacier faces. They did not capture a single clean tone that matched the witness descriptions, despite fair weather and many patient hours. His summary said that absence on his device did not erase the event and that chance and timing rule many field efforts. Visitors returned to Seward with the story and repeated the same careful phrase to outfitters and ticket clerks across several days. They said the sound carried through rails and plastic seats and into bones with calm water and sunny glare. Some remembered a bird silence for a count of 3, while others remembered gulls still calling from a far rock. Several believed a second, softer tone followed a breath later, although others denied hearing any echo at all. Records conflict on that point, and the files highlight the split on memory formed by surprise and light and distance. Autumn moved over the fjords, and the tour schedule thinned, while the harbor quieted between late returns and cold mornings. Park staff closed interviews and boxed their notes with copies of the dispatch logs and the seismic memo and the liaison letter. The working explanation settled on a localized slump into deep water that rang across the inlets with helpful weather. Another line in the file allowed that a submerged ice arch could have collapsed and formed a temporary resonator that sang once. Investigators never confirmed a specific ridge or cove, and the case file ended with a simple statement that the fjords keep their margins in motion. Mason left town before snow and promised to check recordings during the winter if any passengers sent clips by email. Lila kept guiding for 2 more weeks and said the water grew heavy with early swell that pressed against the islands. She told friends that the tone joined her list of things that happen once and bend the world without leaving a clean footprint. She added that clear days carry strange gifts when sound can travel for miles along rock and air and glassy water. She planned to return in spring because the routes were steady and the coves kept teaching quiet lessons to patient crews. The stories. This motel room voicemail rerouted search teams that winter. They kept saying it started with a motel room that smelled like old coffee and bleach, and with a voicemail nobody expected. The recordings came out in late winter after a storm knocked power across the county and kicked the motel phones awake again. Rhea Tavener was 37 and worked as an emergency coordinator for a spread-out mountain county that never felt ready. She had a habit of keeping paper maps rolled in a rubber band and a small camera tucked under her parka. That morning, she wanted only to rebalance commitments and check that the warming shelter had enough cots for the week. She planned to drive the Ridge Road, swing by the radio repeater, and be back before lunch. The incident started when the Nightlark Motel on the highway called the non-emergency line with a strange message they could not clear. The manager, a tired man named Cal Rudd, told the dispatcher that a red light on room 26 blinked, and the phone kept chiming. He said the display showed a new voicemail that would not delete, and he wanted someone to listen because the guest had left. Rhea took the secondary call because the sheriff's deputies were stacked with fender benders on the main grade. She arrived to find the lobby heater making a low metallic whine, and Cal behind a counter with a cracked bell. He slid the room key and nodded toward the outside corridor, his voice flat from too many nights at the same desk. Rhea used nitrile gloves from her field kit, then lifted the handset and dialed the code that the placard said would access messages. The voicemail opened with a tone and a computerized voice reading the timestamp in a clipped monotone. The date announced sounded like last night near 10, according to her quick notes scratched with a blunt pencil. The message that followed had the kind of audio that police technicians describe as close but muddy, and it made her shoulders rise. A woman whispered that a man was hurt, and she asked for help. Then she mentioned mile marker numbers and a guardrail that bent inward toward a runoff ditch. There was wind noise and the distant thrum of trucks, and what Rhea believed might be the quick chirp of a turn signal. The caller finished with words that sounded like two names, then a tired exhale, then silence long enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. By the time she walked back to the lobby, the dispatcher had already compared mile markers that matched those numbers on the East Highway spur. A search team was gathering at the fairgrounds with 2 four-wheelers and a county plow driver who knew every ditch by seat memory. Rhea signed the log and relayed what she heard, and her own words hardened into directions that sent good people toward a cold bend. An hour later, a second caller reached the tip line and said they had heard the same voicemail when calling the motel to complain about their refund. That person repeated the marker numbers and added that a dog barked once in the background, which persuaded the consensus further. Witness statements began clustering around the East Spur, and a deputy noted in the dispatch log that he had seen a bent guardrail near marker 32 2 days prior. The search teams rolled that way in a slow line of lights that looked brave against the blank sky. Rhea drove separately and scanned plow berms that faced the wind, because snow settles in patterns that trap fresh tire ruts longer. She told herself that the timestamp was clean, and that the voice felt close, and that people needed her to stay practical. The first mile produced a stranded sedan with a dead battery and a sheepish driver, and the second mile delivered a drift that swallowed half the lane. They found nothing that matched a serious wreck, only plastic shrapnel and a glove lost last week, which made her think about timing again. Back at the fairgrounds, a radio operator replayed the voicemail on a speaker, and the group leaned in. Rhea asked Cal for the motel's phone vendor contact, and he brought out a binder with hand-printed notes in thick marker. She called the vendor and asked about power cycles and about date behavior when the system lost time, and the technician promised to check archival events. She returned to the voicemail and listened for anything that placed a person rather than a highway, because people leave fingerprints in sound if you keep still. The second listen gave her something new that felt small but pointed. Right after the caller said the mile marker numbers, the wind changed tone for half a second, then a faint clack sounded like an elevator door. That did not belong near a rural guardrail, and it made her write elevator with a question mark next to it, which was not her usual habit. She also caught the soft bleep of a room keycard reader, which could have been the motel hallway if the phone had been on speaker, or a different building entirely. She left the fairgrounds and drove back to the Nightlark with the camera on the seat, planning to map every sound in the hallway against her memory. Cal mentioned that room 26 sat above the ice machine and that the elevator had a sticky door that made a little clap. She asked who stayed in that room last night, and his ledger showed a single occupancy, paid in cash, by someone who wrote a name that did not match any local license. He shrugged and said the guest checked out at 6 and that housekeeping already turned the room. Rhea asked to see the housekeeping cart, and the housekeeper, a careful woman named Jillian North, said she had found the room tidy. Jillian said the phone had been off the hook at first, which she corrected, and she said the window faced the back lot where trucks idled. Rhea asked if anyone had used the lobby phone when power returned, and Jillian said a traveler borrowed it while waiting for a ride that morning. That detail felt important because lobby phones sometimes route through the same server as the room phones, which can create strange behavior. The vendor called back and reported that their server recorded an abnormal offset during the storm, which could shift timestamps for local voicemail. He said the system fell back to a factory clock tied to a different zone, and then resynced once the internet returned, which can mislabel messages. He promised to send a small report, and Rhea wrote down the gist, then underlined the word offset because she disliked anything that moved signposts during a search. The dispatcher added a note in the log with that information, and the group paused to reassess direction. Rhea listened again and measured the gaps between key clicks and the turn signal chirp, and she kept hearing something like a vending machine compressor. She stepped into the hallway and held her phone down by the ice machine, and her recording later showed the same humming cadence. The voicemail might not have been a live plea from a ditch, but could instead be a message recorded in the building and then captured by the motel system during the storm. She asked Cal whether any old messages archived on the server could return as new after a reset. Cal admitted that he had once lost all messages after a lightning strike and then found them again as new after a technician visit. He said the phone guy joked about ghosts calling back to settle their bills, which did not sound funny to Rhea at that moment. She pressed for dates and asked whether past incidents lined up with heavy weather, and he nodded toward a clipboard full of repair tickets. The dates matched cold weeks when snow slid from the roof, and the idea of an old message waking up felt more likely with each line. The next step was to figure out who had left the recording, and whether the details pointed to the East Spur or somewhere entirely different. Rhea asked for prior registration cards for room 26, and Cal produced a stack bound with a rubber band that snapped on the counter. She gently sorted through and found a multi-night stay from late last winter under a name that also did not match a license. The rate was discounted for cash, and the note column said, "Truck Lot View," which fit the sound of idling engines in the message. She then called the State Patrol office and asked for any incidents last winter that involved a bent guardrail near any similar marker numbers. The trooper on duty searched reports and told her there had been a slide-off on the West Highway spur near marker 32 during a storm in late February. He said the driver had fled before dawn, and a passing snowplow called it in, and the car was recovered later without injuries, according to the archived calls. That wreck would have put a person back in town by breakfast, and possibly in a motel room across from trucks. Rhea returned to the audio and timed the interval between the words and the faint elevator clap, and then timed the lobby elevator with her own phone recording. The match was not perfect, but close enough that a court would likely call it consistent under ordinary conditions, according to her training notes. She also realized the turn signal chirp probably belonged to a guest being dropped at the front door, not a car on the highway. The dog bark could have been a pet in the lot, which often happens near the vending area after check-in. She asked the radio operator to broadcast a simple clarification and to slow the east spur sweep while a second team checked the west. The deputy, who remembered the bent rail on the east, admitted he might have mixed the side of the county in his earlier note, which happens when shifts run long. The west team found the old repair spot with fresh snow around the posts and an evidence marker for a past accident half buried under ice. It seemed the voicemail referenced a prior event that had already closed, and their winter storm had wrapped it in new confusion. Rhea then visited the neighboring diner, where the night shift sometimes noticed details people forgot to hide, and she asked about the guest who paid in cash. The server, a college student named Del Finch, said a man sat alone near the window around 9, then stepped outside to take a call. Del remembered because the man cupped his hand over the motel phone receiver in the lobby, which struck Del as old-fashioned, and then asked for a ride to the bus station. That would place the phone call inside the building. During the same hour, the voicemail claimed she requested the motel camera footage for the hallway by room 26, and Cal said the system stored 2 weeks, which happened to straddle their storm. The timestamp on the clip showed a flicker at 9:58, right before the server saw the man on the lobby phone, which made her careful notes lean toward a local recording. A county technician extracted the audio from the clip, and while it was muddy, a mechanical ding from the elevator landed exactly where her earlier timing suggested. The odds of a live highway recording sharing those indoor sounds felt very small. The twist arrived quietly when the vendor finally sent logs that showed the voicemail database replayed queued items after resyncing and labeled some as new. One item matched a stored call from late winter last year that had been partially corrupted, then reconstructed during the reboot. The metadata showed room 26 as the destination for that older call, which explained the light and the stubborn message and made the puzzle sad rather than sinister. The message people heard belonged to a different night and a different problem that resolved without tragedy, and it had been pulled forward by a storm. Rhea wrote a summary for the incident file that emphasized the difference between live audio and replayed audio, then highlighted the risks during outages. She recommended an added step where dispatch confirms time against independent sources when a tip arrives through a system that just recovered. She also asked the motel to change their default message code and to put a note by the desk to call her office if room phones behave oddly after storms. Cal agreed and added a bright sticker to the binder with her number, which made her smile despite the long day. The search teams returned after noon with tired faces and a neat inventory, and they ate chili from a crock that steamed the fairgrounds office. Rhea thanked each person by name and reminded them that a wrong turn during a fast morning did not mean a bad job. She said the lesson was about signals and systems and about winter technology that lies twice, and everyone nodded while they warmed their hands. She filled out the reimbursement forms for fuel and gloves and slid the packet into the outgoing tray with a note for finance. In the evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the paper map unfurled and marked the motel with a small circle. She added a line toward the west spur and penciled in the marker numbers with a question mark to reflect how close memory can sit to fact. She listened to the voicemail one last time through headphones, and this time the vending machine compressor sounded obvious enough that she wondered how she missed it earlier. Fatigue makes patterns where there are none, and urgency can turn a whisper into a highway without much effort. A week later, the vendor installed a firmware update that locked time against a battery backup so power glitches could not shift anything. The sheriff added a line to the dispatch checklist about confirming independent clocks, and the radio operator taped a bold reminder above the console. Jillian named the ice machine Manny as a joke in the break room because it hummed in the same rhythm as the recording. Dell laughed and said the elevator still clapped, but only when someone shoved a luggage cart too hard against the door. In a different winter years ago, the same storm pattern had toppled a repeater and blacked out an entire valley, which lived in Rhea's head. She thought about that while walking past a wall of snow tools at the supply shed, and she decided to put spare batteries for hotel systems on the grant list. It felt like a small change inside a big map, and that was how she survived seasons that piled risk on top of routine tasks. She pinned the grant idea to her bulletin board and wrote a short sentence that read, "Verify time before direction." No one ever found the man who left the cash registration during the recent night because he boarded the bus and vanished into ordinary life. The earlier driver from last winter had been located and fined, according to the archived paperwork, which made that thread tidy in the official sense. The county slid back into the rhythm of plows and calls and an occasional lost tourist, and the motel phones stayed quiet except for room wake-ups. The red light over room 26 stopped blinking, and the ice machine chugged along with stubborn loyalty. Rhea kept the pencil notes in a folder labeled with the motel name and the date and included a copy of the vendor logs. She handed a training copy to the new deputy class and asked them to listen once without context, then again with the building map. The exercise worked because people learned how easily a detail snaps a hunch in half, and how worth it is to test every hunch. They left with a habit of checking other clocks before sending trucks into the cold, which is the sort of habit that quietly saves lives. By late spring, the guardrail on the west spur reflected the sun with a fresh coat of paint, and the plow berms had slipped away. The fairgrounds chili pot was replaced with a cooler of sports drinks, and the radio chatter turned toward camping permits and picnic warnings. Nobody brought up the voicemail during the season kickoff meeting, but everyone remembered the morning they chased a ghost along the east spur. The minutes simply read "Time Verification Protocol Updated," which looked small on paper and felt big in practice. People who were not there will say it was obvious from the start, and they will wonder why teams moved before verifying. People who were there remember the tone in that whisper, and the way good intentions sprint when wind hits the valley wrong. Rhea thinks the truth sits between those angles, and that winter rewards humility more than certainty, especially when phones and storms share a stage. She wrote that in the margin of her map, in handwriting that tilted uphill like a person leaning into a cold night. When she passed the Nightlark one afternoon with the window cracked, she heard the elevator clap echo through the empty corridor. It sounded like a period at the end of a long sentence that finally made sense, and she let the thought linger until the highway bent. The motel squatted back into its season of travelers who just need a warm bed and a snow-free path to the door. The voicemail lived on in a folder, and in the way the county listened to machines, and in the simple habit of checking the time.